For this week's editorial, I would like to have a discussion about priorities. What do people prioritize? Facts or feeling? Ideology or pragmatism? The answer, of course, varies a lot depending on someone's personality, the environment they grew up in, and the experiences they had. But when I look at the mass, intended in the most superficial way possible, I see a surprisingly uniform trend that skews their decisions mainly in two different ways. Radical and rushed decisions in the wake of a deep emotional reaction, or vice versa, if enough time has passed, a strong grip on the status quo and the will to pursue only the pettiest of pragmatic needs. If I think of Japan, for instance, I can't help but notice that as of June 2022, less than 77% of the population has been vaccinated against the plague with 2 doses, and less than 60% has taken the 3rd dose. This skepticism originates in a bunch of very famous cases relating deaths and adverse effects supposedly connected to vaccinations. In 1993, the MMR vaccine was withdrawn over concerns it caused aseptic meningitis. In 2013, the government stopped promoting the HPV vaccine over a limited number of adverse reactions like lasting pain. But most notably, in 2011, 2 vaccines against meningitis and pneumonia were suspended after the death of 4 children. This provoked an incredible emotional reaction at the time that also sparked a lot of conspiracy theories. And when the COVID vaccine was first rolled out, the emotional impact of these incidents was considered one of the reasons for the population's hesitancy, even after the safety and efficacy of the vaccine had been proven, and now that COVID cases are on the rise once again. All the COVID deaths apparently weren't creating a sufficient emotional response. But why do I bring this up? Well, because when I look at politics right now, I see the second kind of reaction. The death of Shinzo Abe at the hands of Tetsuya Yamagami created an incredible emotional response in the Japanese public, who witnessed a political assassination done with a home-built firearm in one of the safest countries in the world, overall, but especially in terms of gun violence. The loud request for an investigation into the motives of the killer unearthed the biggest political scandal in Japan's recent history. The fact that basically the vast majority of the right-wing and governing Liberal Democratic Party has ties to the Unification Church, a cult that tricks its followers with mind-controlling practices into unreasonable donations. The outrage at the death of the former Prime Minister was followed by critics of inaction to the current Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, but in a much more simmering way. Sure, Kishida's appreciation rate has plummeted, but the fact that the party that has been governing Japan almost uninterruptedly for the past 20 years was and still is infiltrated by a radical, extremist religious organization doesn't seem to be bothering many. Proof of this is that if we take out of the picture high-profile people like Kishida's ministers, all of the lawmakers whose ties to the cult have been brought to light are still comfortably in office. And apparently, the party's appreciation rate and people's vote intentions haven't changed much. Basically, if Kishida doesn't raise taxes, although he probably will, we will come to that in a second, or commits another huge PR failure, I think that we won't have any surprises at the ballot boxes next April or if he calls a snap election. I know I might be way too disillusioned, but if the almost complete pervasiveness of an extremist radical cult in one of the 2 major political parties in a developed democracy isn't enough to bring it down to its knees, what will? Well, apparently a tax hike, the most basic and pettiest interest of the average voter. I'm not saying it's not an important thing or it's something that can't cause serious disruption to a person or family's livelihood, but please, let's put the things in perspective. I'm Kay, and this is Japan This Week. Welcome back. So, what about the tax hike? Let's take it from the top. The Kishida administration wants to increase the defense spending. This has always been a long-standing goal of the Abe administration, and now it's Kishida's turn. On November 25, the LDP, the governing party, and Komeito, junior member of the governing coalition, have met and talked about the revision of the 3 key documents that regulate Japan's defense budget, including the National Defense Strategy. Abandoning his long-standing pacifist stance, Komeito joined the LDP in announcing an expansion of the defense budget up from 1% of Japan's GDP to 2% over the course of 5 years. In numbers, this translates into a hike from 5.4 trillion yen per year to 11 trillions of the projected GDP, for a total of around 43 trillion yen from 2023 to 2027. In the following days, Kishida partially explained how he intends using the funds. He wants to triple the number of units armed with ballistic missile interception capabilities, specifically those placed in the southwestern Nansei Islands, where Okinawa is located. He wants to redesign a type of intermediate-range missile that can take down planes to also take down other missiles, especially hypersonic glide weapons, which are speculated to be under development in China and Russia. And last but not least, Kishida wants to increase the number of cybersecurity experts in the Ground Self-Defense Force, aka the Army, and add so-called active cybersecurity policies, which would imply a first strike mentality on an enemy target when an attack is considered probable, and a 24/7 monitoring of Japan's cyberspace. But the most important change Kishida is pushing for is the adoption of preemptive counter-strike capabilities through missiles, in order to disable enemy bases in the event of an attack on Japan. Okay, let's pause for a minute. It's absolutely understandable that Japan is considering an overhaul of its defensive capabilities. Given the international situation with Russia invading Ukraine, China pushing more and more for Taiwan and arming itself, and North Korea launching missiles over Japan, fears of a possible conflict are absolutely justified. Raising the defense budget would put Japan in par with its NATO allies, where the average defense expense is around 2% of each nation's GDP. But this radical change in posturing from a supposedly pacifist nation to a first strike preemptively offensive one is scary and historically dangerous to say the least, and it could also be both unconstitutional and in violation of international treaties. First of all, there are international treaties that prohibit the practice of a first strike on accusations of preparing an attack, for obvious reasons. Japan would have to create a clear and internationally accepted definition of when an enemy nation has begun preparing an attack. And moreover, both the Cybersecurity Act and the counter-strike missiles could be in violation of the Constitution. While Article 21 protects the secrecy of communications, prohibiting the proposed plan of 24/7 monitoring, never mind that it's a China-style government overreach, Article 9 of the Constitution, the pacifist article, states that Japan renounces to war as a right of the nation, and the state has no right to belligerence. But as many of you already know, it's been decades that Japan has abandoned this stance de facto, if not de jure, building itself an army under a different name and progressively increasing its military budget. So at the end of the day, even the counter-strike capability could be justified in a defense optic, reducing everything to just the problem of semantics. Critics have been pointing this stuff out every day since the announcement, and even more so, they have questioned if the government actually has a plan, which brings us to the tax issue. The Asahi argues that Kishida handled the situation backwards, and I agree, the timeline makes very little sense. First, on November 25, Kishida announced he wants to increase the defense spending, without outlining any practical use for it, nor how it will find the money to do so, but talking about the counter-strike missiles, which still didn't have the approval to be used. Then, on November 29, he announced the money target figures and quite literally told his defense and finance ministers, "Find me the money." And only on December 5, we got to see a draft plan of the contents of this new budget. It's as if when you have to do groceries, instead of doing a list, looking at your budget, and then deciding where to go, first you set a budget double your usual. Then ask your family for money, then you decide the store to shop in, and when you're there, you start making the list. The main reason for the increase seems to be going to average NATO levels of spending rather than real cost effectiveness. And the most unbelievable thing is that to this day, the government still doesn't have a plan on how to fund its own proposal. The government-appointed tax panel said that the most viable source for funding for this program will be increasing taxation on corporations and households, given the fact that the government will have to find little less than 11 trillion yen per year. LDP lawmakers, of course, bash the idea as impossible, given the fact that not only inflation is rising and consumer power is shrinking, but that this move would most likely bite them back in April at the next election cycle, or if Kishida will call snap elections like his predecessor. The government then said it will postpone the tax hikes to 2027, with Shunichi Suzuki, the finance minister, saying that he plans on finding the money through expenditure reforms, which means cutting funding elsewhere, issuing new government bonds, which means more debt, and using the surplus of already allocated COVID relief funds for companies. But beside the fact that these sources of revenue are not stable because you can cut up until a certain point and indebt yourself up to a certain point, the issuing of new bonds at this moment is considerable quite reckless, if not technically illegal. How so? Because of debt, that's why. Issuing new bonds means that the nation is indebting itself to its investors, those who will buy the bonds. Japan's national debt is already over 1 quadrillion yen. So when the moment to find the money to repay this debt will come, the future generations will have to suffer for the reckless moves of past lawmakers. If you pair this information with the fact that a group of LDP lawmakers issued a proposal to scrap the rule that forces the Japanese government to repay the bonds entirely after 60 years, you can clearly see the level of unpreparedness of this whole plan. And as I said, it could also be illegal. After World War II, in fact, not only Japan adopted the pacifist constitution, but it also enacted the finance law, which, is my understanding, prohibits the government from issuing deficit financing bonds to increase the military spending. This was obviously done to prevent the reckless military spending and buildup that spiraled Japan into the war. And if the government will be allowed to ignore this, it will set a very dangerous precedent. That's it for this week. I want to try out a slightly different format for these videos, but my time to make them is limited and every week I find myself coming up short. But there will be some changes in the future. That said, thank you for watching, and if you liked my work, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe. See ya! For this week's editorial, I would like to have a discussion about priorities. What do people prioritize?